Okay, at this point you have probably learned already about Mendel and the discoveries that he made when he was crossing plants and learning about dominant and recessive traits. You may have also done some monohybrid squares using dominant and recessive traits to try to predict what future generations will be like. Now we're going to talk about more complex patterns of inheritance, things that make those Punnett squares a little bit trickier. Okay, the first more complex form of inheritance we're going to talk about is polygenic. The prefix poly means many, and then genic, many genes. These are traits that are influenced by several genes, not just one gene. There's not just a dominant and recessive. Examples of these kinds of traits includes things like height, eye color, and skin color. If you think about height, it makes sense. There's not just tall or short. You've got all these different heights in between. For eye color, there's not just brown or blue. There's many different kinds of eye color. And skin color, so many beautiful shades of brown. So skin color, we're going to do some problems in class. Skin color actually may involve at least 4 pairs of alleles or genes with 9 or more possible shades of skin color. That's called a polygenic trait, and we'll talk more about that in class. Okay, another important kind of complex trait are called complex characters. Complex characteristics are characteristics that are influenced by both the genes and the environment. The most famous example of that is height. Height is determined by an unknown number of genes, probably as many as a half dozen determine how tall we are, but it's also influenced by factors such as nutrition and disease. I wish I had a photo. There's a very famous photo of 2 twin young men who were raised apart, and one man was raised in a healthy environment and the other young man unfortunately was raised in a very neglectful home, and they are several inches different even though they're identical twins. So their height ended up being several inches different, and that was due to the individual who was raised in a neglectful atmosphere. His poor nutrition kept his height lower. So that's an example of a complex character. It's influenced by both your genes and your environment. Okay, next are the multiple allele problems. If you think about the name, it sounds a lot like polygenic. Remember that polygenic means many genes, and those are traits that are controlled by many different genes. So maybe you have gene 1 that has a dominant and a recessive, and then gene 2 that has a dominant recessive, and then gene 3 that has a dominant recessive form. Multiple allele problems are traits that have more than 2 forms of the gene. So instead of 1 dominant and 1 recessive possibilities, there's a 3rd or 4th or 5th possibility for that one gene. The easiest example, and it's a traditional example we teach in biology, is blood types, and that's one that everybody's interested in. If you think about the different blood types, you might remember that there's A, B, AB, and O blood types. So the question is, where do those different blood types come from? And we'll talk about that. Red blood cells have proteins on the outside of their cell membranes, and the scientists who discovered these proteins came up with the ingenious names for these proteins. They called the first protein they identified A. They identified the next protein and they called it B. And then they identified individuals who don't have either of those proteins, and they called those individuals O. It's kind of like an empty set. So there are individuals who have A proteins on the outside. There are individuals, and so we call them type A. There are individuals who have B proteins, which are a different shape, and we call them type B. There's some individuals who have both A and B proteins, so obviously they're type AB, and then the ones who don't have those proteins are called type O. Okay, this is where the concept of multiple allele comes from. With blood types, there are actually 3 possible choices. You still get 2 genes from your parents. You get one from your mom and one from your dad. But instead of the only choices being a dominant and a recessive, there's actually 2 dominant genes that you could receive and 1 recessive gene. So the A and the B genes are the ones that code for the A and the B proteins. They are both dominant, and we call, when you have more than one that's dominant, you refer to them as codominant. If you inherit an A gene from your mom, you're going to have A proteins. If you inherit a B gene from your dad, you're also going to have B proteins. So those are the individuals that are going to be type AB. The other gene that's possible to receive is what we refer to as the type O gene, and that's a recessive gene. That's a gene for no proteins. So let's think this through. If you have A genes, your phenotype, or the way that we describe you, is type B. I meant A proteins, I don't know what I said. If you have B proteins, you're type B. If you have both A and B proteins on your surface, we call you type AB. And if you have none, we call you type O. So here's the question that I want you to think about. What are the possible genotypes? The phenotypes are what you see, the physical description. The genotypes are what two letters these individuals inherited from their parents. What are the possibilities? Well, if you're type A, we know for sure you got a capital A. We know that. The question is, what is your second letter? What did you get from that other parent? You could have gotten another A, and that would give you type A blood. But you could also have gotten a lowercase o. You could have gotten that recessive O. Because A is dominant over O, you would have A proteins on your blood. So there's two possibilities. It's very similar for those of you that have type B blood. You would have inherited one B protein, or one B gene, I'm sorry, from one parent. You could have inherited a second B gene, or your second gene could have been a type O because O is recessive. An O gene is what I'm trying to say. So you could be big B, or big B, little o. Those are the possibilities. There's only one genotype possibility. If you're type AB, you would have inherited a capital A from one parent and a capital B from the other parent. And then the last genotype, type O, you have to have received two recessive genes from both parents, one O from one parent and one O from the other parent. The last thing I want to say about this, because people get this mixed up all the time, there are never, ever, ever lowercase a's or lowercase b's. A and B are always dominant, so you always use capital letters because they're dominant. The only lowercase letter you would use in a monohybrid Punnett square, the only lowercase letter you would use is the lowercase o. Okay, in the last two slides, we talked about multiple alleles and how blood has three different possible choices. But we mentioned codominance. That's where you have two dominant traits. And if they both show up, if you inherit one from each parent, then they both show up in your phenotype. So if you get a capital A and a capital B, you are type AB. Well, incomplete dominance is very similar. There are two dominant traits again, but this time, instead of both showing up, which might produce a red and white flower if you had a red gene that was dominant and a white gene that was dominant, instead they blend together and you produce a pink flower. So a red carnation parent mated to a white carnation parent produces pink offspring. Red and white are both dominant and they blend. That's called incomplete dominance. Another example, a little bit more complicated, has to do with a disease called sickle cell anemia, which we'll learn more about in another unit. Individuals who are heterozygous for sickle cell anemia, that means they got one copy for sickle cell and one copy without sickle cell, they have a mild form of the disease. And so that's what makes it incomplete dominance instead of complete dominance. Okay, next are what's called the sex-influenced and the sex-limited traits. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail about the difference between the two. What I want you to understand is that they're different depending on whether you're male or female. They are not, however, carried on the X or Y chromosome. Remember that females have two X chromosomes and males have an X and a Y chromosome. These traits are not carried on the chromosomes that determine our gender. That's why both men and women experience these traits. So both men and women carry the genes, but the presence of hormones affects how these genes are expressed. The primary hormone in women is estrogen, the primary hormone in men is testosterone, and the presence of those hormones affects how those traits look. The most common example is male pattern baldness. It's dominant in men and recessive in women because of the influence of testosterone in men. Okay, this is the last slide in our presentation today. We're just giving you some examples of sex-influenced traits. Again, sex-influenced traits are found both in men and women because it doesn't have anything to do with our sex chromosomes. The examples that I'm going to expect you to know for our test would be beard growth in women and breast development in men. Women normally don't grow beards, but we have the gene to grow beards. It's our high levels of estrogen and low levels of testosterone that prevent most of us from growing beards. Likewise, men have the gene for developing breasts, but because they have high levels of testosterone and low levels of estrogen, we don't usually see that. These photos are of women who had obviously problems with their hormones, and it led to beard development. The reason that we don't normally see what are called bearded ladies today is that today we have easy access to razor blades and laser surgeries that can help women who have these hormonal imbalances. We also have medications, but this is something that was fairly common in the past. That's it. Let me know if you have any questions.